Hello, everybody, and welcome back for the 9th and the final session of this year's European Spectrum Management Conference. Now, I say the final session. It is the final session, but it's actually going to be split into 3 specific parts. So we're going to have what we're calling the Spectrum Shorts. So the discussions in this session are maybe going to be a little bit more interactive even than some of the other ones. So we haven't got with the exception of this first session where we have an introductory presentation, we haven't got any presentations. They're more going to be fireside chat format. So looking at some of the key issues with panelists, with experts in a more interactive format in the way. And we're going to be looking at 3 specific issues, as I mentioned. So first of all, the first session in a second is going to be focusing on EMF and looking at safeguarding health and building consumer confidence in a 5G world. We then move on immediately following that to a session that's going to be looking at connectivity for drones and unmanned aerial systems. And then we have a short break before we have our final Spectrum Short, which is going to be looking at fixed wireless access. And then we're wrapping up everything today with our final closing ceremony, which, as I mentioned before, is going to have conclusions from a number of speakers and also live music. So something for you all to finish off the week with there with some live music. So we better get started then. So I'd like to then pass over to our moderator for the opening session. That's to William Webb from WebSearch. William, welcome. Great to have you with us. And yeah, really looking forward to this. It's an issue I think that we have focused on at our 5G conference before, but never at this Spectrum conference before, the issue of EMF. So really looking forward to the discussion. So yeah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dan. And yes, it's an interesting topic. It's one of those topics that's been around for a long time, of course. I remember getting involved in some health concern work way back in 1991, and it keeps reappearing. But I think I was certainly taken very much by surprise by the strength of the reaction to 5G in health concerns, not just people raising concerns, but of course even burning down some masts. We've had the whole of the conspiracy that it's causing COVID, utterly ridiculous, of course, but nevertheless persisting. And maybe it's fading a bit now, I don't know, but it's unclear to what extent it's having an impact or will have an impact on 5G and indeed on other radio systems into the future. So I think it's a really timely panel and it's a great session. We have 4 extraordinarily well qualified individuals to inform us and hopefully to have a debate, and we would very much value questions, thoughts, inputs from you in the normal way. We're going to start with a 10-minute introductory presentation from Jafar Kashfari, who is extremely well qualified to set things off. He's the chairman of the IEEE International Committee on Electromagnetic Safety. He's an adjunct professor of bioelectromagnetics at Aalto University in Helsinki, has spent 20 years or more looking at regulations and standards management at companies that include Microsoft, Nokia, Huawei, and Intel. And he leads the standards activities for RF and EMF safety of device compliance assessment at the IEC, the IEEE, and the ITU. Jafar, over to you to open us up, please.
William, you might notice actually that I'm not Jafar. He seems to have actually just dropped off the connection. So
oh no,
we seem to have some technical issues. So what I can maybe suggest, if it's okay, let's switch the order. We'll try and sort that. But maybe if we can go into the discussion first of all, and then we can hear from Jafar afterwards. So apologies for that. Yes, he's dropped off at exactly the wrong moment. So apologies. But if we can maybe do that, and then we'll come back to Jafar afterwards, if that's okay.
No worries at all. And
okay.
I know how that happens. I had my computer crash the other day at a very moment. Yeah, let's do just that. So we have 3 panelists, and I'm going to bring them on one at a time and ask them to just make a few opening remarks, introduce them as I do that. Beautifully distributed. We've got 1 from a regulator, 1 from an operator, and 1 from IGNIRP, the most important committee in the space of health impacts of non-ionizing radiation. So let's start with Gilles. Gilles Bregnon is the Director General of ANFR. Gilles, we've had 5G networks in Europe now for a year or more. Do we know much about the EMF? What do we know about what's been happening out there? I guess some measurements have been taking place.
Yes, so thanks for the invitation, and that's an occasion, of course, to come to what we know about 5G, because the great news about 5G EMF is that it's no longer science fiction. As you said, 5G has been authorized in many European countries since for months and even years, in fact. In France, it's been authorized last year, and we already have authorized in my agency 25,000 transmitters with some kind of 5G capacity. So that's about 43% of the transmitters active in France. So it's no longer experimental, it's being deployed. So 5G EMF can be measured. So we out of fake news and rough ideas, we are now in facts and evidence. So the first point that needs to be quoted is that there is no one single 5G. There are three different 5G. 5G world is a part of is made of three worlds. The first world is a world of low bands, where you already have 2G, 3G, 4G. So these bands may now talk 5G. The second world is the world of the mid-band. So it is 3.5 gigahertz band, which is the most heavily used today band for 5G only in Europe. And then the third world is the millimetric band. So what do we see in these three bands? We've made in my agency very, very many measurements, because this year in 2020, we're going to make up to 10,000 field measurements asked by people or decided by ourselves, just to gather evidence about 5G measurement. And we also measure SAR of the terminals, because there's also a 5G EMF issue in SAR, so we need to control that. So if we come to the measurements, so what do we see? The first thing, which is simple, is that in lower bands we see nothing. In fact, 5G is just a way for a transmitter to speak a foreign language, but if it has the same power, the same band as it used to have in 4G, the exposure is the same. So there's no impact in 5G in the bands so far used by other technologies, 2G, 3G, 4G. What we see in millimetric bands, not much, because millimetric bands have not been authorized in all countries, and when they are tested, we did some tests with millimetric bands, what we see is that there are small cells. So it's a small cell issue with low power and short distance. So there could be exposure if you're very close to these equipments, but so far these equipments are scarce, and we don't see a noticeable impact of 26 gigahertz on the global exposure. So we focused on the 3.5 mid-band 5G. There we've got only 5G, and the big breakthrough here is that we have beamforming antennas. So what do we see here? First, we see a slight increase. This is normal because we put more spectrum for 5G for mobile telephony, so it's normal that you get an increase of the exposure. But this exposure is first time dependent, because it depends on the traffic, and it depends also on the number of terminals. And so far, the number of terminals is rather low, in fact, because the uptake of 5G across customers across Europe is rather slow. So as a matter of fact, what we see is an increase of exposure that will take months, even years. And for that, in France, we've decided to deploy probes in a number of major cities just to monitor the increase of exposure, real-time, open data. So what we want to build really is rebuild consumer confidence based on facts, on measurement, and see where 5G is going to bring the exposure. And the simulation we've been doing in big cities is that we expect that the exposure, total exposure, could be increased by 30 or 50% at the end of the deployment of transmitters and terminals. So in a few years. So the increase of exposure is moderate, because the exposure initially was low, and it's much better controlled with 5G than with previous technologies. So we're keeping an eye on this, and it will take some time before we reach the target exposure of 5G. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Gilles. Really interesting, and really important that we have real-world data, because without it, of course, it's very, very difficult to make any serious recommendations and indeed to address concerns. I'd like to turn now to Eric van Rongen, who is the Vice Chair of the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, or ICNIRP. Eric, so we've heard that there aren't really any obvious evidences of health issues. Why do you think there's so much concern out there still? Have you got any feel for that?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation, and I'm happy to give some explanation on that. What I think personally is that people are just scared of anything that has to do with radiation, just because it is radiation, and the term radiation is something that has a negative context for many people. But there are different types of radiation. Of course, this has nothing to do with real dangerous types of radiation like ionizing radiation or X-rays or even UV radiation. This is something completely different. This is the only established effect that comes out of the scientific literature is that it may result in heating of tissues or the body, and too much heat is something that is not good for you. So that's something that the ICNIRP guidelines try to avoid as much as possible. Actually, if you there are large margins of uncertainty in the ICNIRP guidelines built in, so they're very conservative. If you stick to the ICNIRP guidelines, there's no way that you can get heated or parts of the body can get heated in any way. So in that respect, they're expected to be safe. Of course, there are also concerns about other issues than heating of tissue. A lot of people are concerned that, for instance, use of a mobile phone very close to their head may result in an increased risk for brain tumors. There are a lot of studies that have been performed in that respect. Some studies do show some indications that there might be something going on, but if you look at the overall evidence, and that's something you should always do, you should not rely on one single study or one or two single studies, but you should look at the overall evidence. If you do that, then you have to come to the conclusion that there's nothing established. There's certainly no firm evidence that indeed exposure to radio frequency fields can result in brain tumors or other types of cancer. And also, there's no evidence that it may result in other types of diseases. So actually, heating is the only thing that has been established. And ICNIRP performed a very large review of the scientific literature preceding the issue of the new guidelines last year. So we are very much up to date in that respect, and we keep an eye on what's going on in the scientific literature. And if there would be a reason to change the guidelines, we will do that. But for so far, there's no reason. So yeah, the main message is if you stick to the ICNIRP guidelines and the exposure limits, then you should be safe. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Eric. And actually, I've often thought that in terms of the handset being very close to the head, that's something that actually is reducing these days as people make less phone calls, or if they do, they tend to use earpieces. And I've never quite worked it out, but the younger generation seem to make phone calls like this, which I don't quite understand, but it would also seem to be slightly better. But anyway, that's an aside. Let's bring in the last of our panelists, who is Alma Fazzolari, who's a manager at TIM in Italy. So Alma, one thing we do know is that the limits are not exactly the same across all of the European countries. Do you have any thoughts on that? What the reasons behind that might be, and what the impact of that will be on concerns and on operators? I think you're on mute, Alma.
Sorry, I was in the mute. Thank you for the invitation. I think that in Europe, where we talk about digitization and services to be guaranteed to customers, we cannot continue to have different electromagnetic field limits. For example, Italian electromagnetic field limits are much more restrictive compared to the value recommended by the ICNIRP and adopted in the majority of European countries. Since that in Italy we have electromagnetic fields 100 times lower in terms of power and 10 times lower in terms of electrical field. Different limits mean penalizing the operators of nations or regions because they will have much higher infrastructure development costs. And this slows down the digitization of countries and therefore services to customers. It is also not correct to think that the lower the limits are, the better is. And I propose a comparison with the weight, kilograms, respecting the proportions. So, 25 kilograms is the threshold value. It means that if I continuously lift 25 kilograms, I get back pain. What did ICNIRP? It said 500 grams. To avoid back pain, the ICNIRP has set a limit of 500 grams. Is the weight of a little bottle of water. The little bottle of water that we give to our kids to go to school, or that we carry all day in our handbag, and so I can drink when I'm thirsty. What we did in Italy, 5 grams. In Italy, to be very cautious, the limit is 5 grams. 5 grams, however, they do not allow to give our daughters the little bottle of water to go to school. And I would have to give my daughters 100 micro bottles of water to have the same water as the other European kids. Now, do you think that 5 grams are safer than 500 grams? I do not believe. Carrying a 500 grams of water has never caused back pain. Even if you don't have water to drink, it's not really good for your health. So, to conclude, it is important to have safe limits, and ICNIRP limits are. However, it is equally important to have the same electromagnetic limits field all over Europe to give equal opportunities to all European operators and to be able to guarantee all European citizens the same services. For example, think about how penalizing it is to have such low limits compared to the rest of Europe, having to cover and provide services, for example, for automotive, for industry, and have to cover motorways, suburban roads, cities, ports, and so on. So we therefore hope that Europe will also be united on the issues of electromagnetic fields limits. We hope so.
Great, thanks very much, Alma. And I think some important points there. Obviously, it's really restrictive for operators to have lower limits, and that means you either can't roll out the same level of service or you have much greater costs. But I think it also casts doubts on other countries. When activists can then say, well, how come the limits are lower in Italy than they are in our country? Is it safer in Italy and not so safe here? And I think that's a real issue. I think start us off with questions. And by the way, everyone out there, please do throw in questions or observations. One of my thoughts has been that to some degree, a lot of the pushback that we see from activists or otherwise is illogical, because you can clearly point out to them there's no scientific basis or no evidential basis for their concerns. And yet they still persist. And I wonder if actually the best thing to do is just say nothing almost and leave it be, because anything you say tends to inflame opinions. I mean, do you think that's the right approach, or do you think it's actually better to be out there just continually putting out more and more information that just tries to quash those concerns? Feel free for everyone to dive in, whoever wants to go first on that.
Jill, well, maybe I can respond. Yeah. I think it's important to continue following the scientific developments and to discuss that also, for instance, at scientific meetings. And in the end, for organizations like ICNIRP, IEEE, and WHO to evaluate the state of science and base recommendations on that state of science. The problem is at the moment that there are a couple of scientists around the world who think differently from the mainstream scientists. And these people sometimes are very vocal, and they publish in usually not very well journals, but anyway, they publish in scientific journals. So they have their opinions spread out. And in doing that, they also try to damage ICNIRP. They shoot at the messenger instead of at the message. And it's very difficult to defend yourself against all that sort of allegations. So we as ICNIRP try to stick to the science and let the science speak for itself. But obviously there are some people who have a different interpretation of the science than we do.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. So staying quiet might be an appropriate strategy if everyone else stay quiet, but as soon as others start publishing, you've got to have an equal weight, at least an equal weight, if not more, weight of publications to offset that. Gilles, did you want to?
Yes, I fully support the views of Eric considering science. I mean, we are in a situation where we need to be scientific, and a lot of people talking about 5G and the hazards of 5G don't really have a serious scientific background. So we have to put evidence in the basket, and so people can share the evidence and see things, and then at the end of the day, science always wins. In fact, so we need to give material, so to share material. We don't want to hide anything. That's why we are open data now in France, and I think it's a good evolution, because providing data can make anybody able to actually check with its own solutions, and as long as people are fair and share their ways of considering the data, then we can actually make progress. But it's very listening to Alma. It's a bit weird, because as a matter of fact, you have activists burning transmitters. But if these persons were scientific enough, they would actually burn their smartphones. Because in fact, the smartphone, when the transmitter is low, the smartphone has to use more power, and the smartphone is much more close to your body than the transmitter. So in fact, there's a misunderstanding of the physics behind mobile telephony waves and so on, and we need to actually put pedagogy and information here for people to understand what is at stake, because they just forget the basics of radio liaisons.
I sometimes feel like saying to some of these people, well, of course, if you're worried about your phone, then you should throw away your DECT cordless home phone, your home Wi-Fi router, and all these other things, because they're much closer to you than the base station. But I don't say it because I don't think it will help.
But to some extent, it's like, people talk about pollution, and they're very anxious about outside pollution. But sometimes they get much more polluted when they repaint their room, for instance, during the holiday time, because of the various volatile.
Alma, what about you? Is Tim putting out public?
It's true what Gilles says. The problem is not the base station that it is for me. The problem is the phone that is is next to me. And if the base station is too far, I have to shout out very high. So I prefer to have the base station closer to me, so the radiation near my head is lower. And this is a thing that people sometimes didn't think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And very important. And also that when we use 5G, 4G, 3G, 2G, operators work always under ECNIRP limits, so it is safe for us.
So
I think also an important point is that there's a difference in the people see the radiation from mobile phone masts and from their own devices. I mean, you cannot control the emission from mobile phone masts. You're sort of involuntarily exposed all the time, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, while you can choose to use your mobile phone or not. So that may also be of importance in the way people perceive the exposure from phone masts. Actually, I had a look at the website that you have established in France, looking at the constant monitoring. I was very impressed by that, and it very clearly shows that at all times the actual exposure is much below the ICNIRP guidelines, and there's also a large variation over the day and over the week, of course. But it's very instructive to see that. So I can hope that sort of websites can be established in more countries, so people can actually have a look at themselves live to the actual exposure limits.
So that leads us beautifully into the first question, actually, which is from Joe Lynch at Comreg, the Irish regulator, who says basically that he thinks it would be a good idea, and asks the question, what difficulties were there in terms of setting up the monitoring? Was that easy to do? Was it straightforward? Would it be something that could actually be sort of a template that could be used by other regulators to get some sort of commonality across multiple countries? So to you, I think, Gilles.
Well, in fact, the biggest difficulty was to find the credits for paying the project. In fact, but when you get the budget, then it's easy, because what we did first was to provide to any Frenchman requiring it the capacity to actually order an accredited measurement, for instance, in their home or just in front of their place. So actually, you can actually apply. You just have to sign in a form, in fact, and then somebody coming from an accredited company, which is paid by ANFR, will come and make the measurement, and the measurement will be posted on one of our websites, which is called cartoradio.fr. And so all the measurements are posted, and you can actually compare them, and you have free access to it. If you want to buy a house, then you can actually, if it has had a measurement before, you can actually see the level that you get in that house because it's posted. So that was the first step. So after some time, we had a discussion with our with the company we're working with, and they said, but how about putting probes? Because we can develop probes, and then the probes are here, so we don't have to send people in places where we have much traffic, for instance. So we decided to actually support this approach, and they can actually sell probes in France or even outside France. And we also use ourselves their probes in a few cities, and in some places in France, the cities were against 5G, and they said, okay, we want to unleash 5G, but we want the probes. So we exchanged the probes against 5G, and that's a good deal, in fact, because they can actually monitor the effect of 5G on the citizens and see that the effect is very low, in fact. And these probes are open data, as Eric said. You can actually access them on a website and see the variation, and that's also education, because you can see that even with 4G you have a variation, and there's no problem with these measurement campaigns. You simply have to make a contract, and then people accept these campaigns, and they are. Well, they are safe because they know that they have a document with the level of radiation, and even if they see a transmitter through the window, they know that the transmitter doesn't impact them that much.
Mm. And I guess any other regulator could buy the same probes from that company.
Of course, we can provide the name of the company if you want.
Fantastic. Okay, so I mean that sounds like quite a promising way ahead, particularly for regulators that are seeing a lot of resistance in their country. We had another question. I think this is a fairly quick one, actually. So it was just asking the question, do the ICNIRP guidelines need to be updated to include not only exposure from base station, but from handset? Eric, my understanding is they already do that, but it's worth probably you just clarifying that.
Yeah, exactly. The ICNIRP guidelines cover both total body exposures, like from antennas, and partial body exposures, like when using your headset. So that's completely covered by the guidelines.
Great. Yeah, I thought that would be the case. We have a question for Alma. So what processes does Tim employ to confirm that you're compliant with the EMF limits in Italy? Is that just purely a modelling one, or do you measure, or some mix of both?
We make field tests. I think that like every operators, and we always are under the Italian level that, as I said before, are very, very low. And unfortunately, we have only 6 voltmeters instead of 61 voltmeters in Europe, and it's very, very hard. I think that you understand how it's hard for us and how is higher the cost of our infrastructure. So I repeat, I hope that we will be Europe all together with the same limits. Yeah,
and I guess you've made that case to the regulator, but I guess with no impact so far. But maybe it
must be mandatory for Europe. I hope.
Yeah, so actually having regulation at a European Commission level would be better in some respects to get a consistency across the whole of Europe. Yeah. One question from me, one area that I thought might be a potential weakness for 5G is, and we sort of touched upon it briefly, is the beamforming area. Of course, if you form a very narrow beam, then you do concentrate the power in that space. Now, most of the time that's fine because the beam is jumping around, so you're not going to stay in the beam for very long. But could you envision a situation, maybe it's a fixed subscriber in their house downloading a high definition video over quite some time, that you had a very static beam that might actually impact on somebody for a long time period? Would that be a concern?
Well, maybe we made measurement about this beam forming, because of course it's a novel characteristics in 5G, and what we developed a way actually to provide a statistic level of exposure based on beam forming, because when you think about beam forming, you should not think about the beam being focused on somebody, because in fact focusing the beam provides you with an incredible data rate. In fact, you get well, on an antenna you've got 4 beams, for instance, and you got 1/4 of the total capacity of the antenna continuous, and it's fiber optics at the antenna basis. So it's huge, and nobody uses that much, in fact. So in fact, the beam should not be seen as something static. The best example I had is to consider the beam as a server in a restaurant. You've got 4 servers in a big restaurant. It's very difficult to have the server with you during the whole lunch discussing. It's impossible. Yeah. If there are persons in the restaurant, which is rare these days, of course, but one day they come back, and as a matter of fact, it's extremely unlikely that the beam is static, because the beam has to serve all the persons around, and when you're fed up with the data, it stops. So the beam is not shooting at you if you don't need the data. If you have data enough and you're alone in the dark in the middle of the night, it will stop when you've got your 4 gigabytes, and that will be extremely fast, 30 seconds. So there's no static beam, and the problem is we are with 5G we enter into a statistical way of appreciating the exposure, which is novel.
Yes, another example is that instead of a chandelier that is always on, we can turn on a table lamp only where and when it is needed. Yeah. So 5G with active antennas is better also for radiation, because it's lower. You use only when you need it. Yeah. You don't have to switch on always chandelier for all the rooms, but only where you need it.
And if we follow up on the Alma's metaphor, in fact, it's like a scene in a theater, but there's no star. So in fact, the spot doesn't stop on a single person. Everybody has to be served. Even the musicians, the singers, and the chief orchestra, and so on, the director, and so on.
Okay, so we've got just a few minutes left before I'm then going to move to Jaffa. So I'm going to ask one last question, give each a chance to kind of answer it, and any last thoughts. So just a minute or so each, please. So we're now starting to get about 6G. What lessons can we take from this whole 5G experience moving into 6G, especially given that, and to a point one of the questions is made, that perhaps it's not driven so much by logic but by emotion. So is there a different way we might handle it looking forward to 6G? Let's start with Eric and then go to Alma and then Gilles. Eric, any thoughts from you?
Well, I think maybe a very good communication about the novel systems is something that's very important. People just don't understand what changes with respect to the old systems, and if they understand that, then they will understand also that at least from 4G to 5G, basically the overall exposure will in time go down. So that's probably also going to be the case with 6G. So communication is a key issue, I think.
Yeah. Alma?
Thank you. We have to anticipate good communication with respect to fake news.
Yeah.
Because this is, I think, the most important thing. Good communication, true communication, not only good, but good and true communication with respect to fake news.
Yeah. So expecting there will be some fake news and being prepared to handle it. Yeah.
We have to anticipate, only this.
Gilles, last thoughts from you?
Well, in my view, there's a kind of continuum of what is being sold by operators since 3G. If you watch what was said about 3G when we had 2G, it's very much like what was sold for 5G when we have 4G, and what will be sold for 6G when we have 5G. I mean, there's always something like a paradise where you get seamless contact with the rest of the world at any time, any place, anywhere. But it's always the same, I would say, the same doxa. Simply, this doxa is more and more efficient when you get social networks and so on. So with 5G, we had fake news because the doxa has spread very quickly, but it was the same doxa as before. And then the reality comes, and the reality of 5G is a bit disappointing compared to the expectations of 5G. It's much better than 4G, but it's worse than 6G, in fact. But as a matter of fact, the problem is not necessarily the capacity of fighting the fake news. It's the capacity of putting people towards the facts, seeing that there is advertising, which is a bit extreme, but the results should be considered, and the results is a better service with probably less exposure for better data rate, and this has to be sold for what it is. Maybe there's a need to de-advertise the stuff a bit because it's been over-advertised, and so that creates of course anxiety.
Good point, and yeah, a bit less hype. Right, I'm going to have to stop the panel there because hopefully we can have Jaffa now after his technical difficulties. So Jaffa, I did actually introduce you. I don't know if you heard me doing so I won't do so again. I'll just pass straight over and make a presentation. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody from Helsinki. We are celebrating the Midsummer Festival. The Eve day is today, so it's actually off day. But let's start with the presentation. So if you make it bigger, then I guess, yeah, great. Thank you very much. So I thought that we can put the discussion in a form of questions, which would more maybe simply convey our message to you. So this is the outcome of the study carried out by ITU, why we did this study, how we did it, and what were the outcomes of this study. And then we will have some recommendation to regulators and all stakeholders. Actually, we already had some good input and proposal suggestions from the previous speakers. If we go to the next slide. So the objective was here is presented in 4 bullet points. So gathering, collecting information from European administrations on the impact of the EMF, understand what are the associated administrative procedure for the verification of compliance with their legislation when they're putting into operation, and what are the existing challenges in the pace of rollout of 5G mobile networks. But these actually recommendations and input equally applies to the 6G and emerging technologies. So also supporting at the end regulators in exchanging their experience in managing risk communication, those countries who have been more successful than others. Next slide. So what is the out of scope here? We are not dealing with the EMF exposure limits, neither with any information with regards to the health impacts. I guess ICNIRP is present here as well, so I left it to ICNIRP to deal with that question completely. Now to the next slide. So how the study was carried out. We had 5 categories of questions. So a questionnaire with these 5 categories were sent to the national regulatory bodies, telecommunication ministries, and other regulatory bodies. This is actually 46 countries in Europe and EMEA region, so it's not only mainland Europe. And EMF regulations, the first category, and then how the approval procedures are done. Are there single or multiple stages in approval procedure? What about the EMF assessment? Because the limits are there, but how the assessment procedure and protocols, the availability with regards to the 5G, how the public has been accepting this technology, what has been the challenging, and then the last but not the least is the risk communication, how the risk communication has been managed in those countries. Next slide. So what were the outcome of the studies? 31 responses from public authorities of 29 countries. So that 29 and 31 may a little bit confuse you, but we have got more responses on different topics separately, kindly provided by regulatory bodies. Maybe here I should thank all the regulatory bodies who have provided responses and supported this study, including our colleague Jill from ENFR, who has provided extensive response to this questionnaire. So responses were mainly detailed and very clear. Some countries left some questions unanswered. Maybe they didn't have any specific position or actions taken for those categories. And some countries actually provided more useful details for our questions. And one question which I would have put, which we did notice a little bit late, whether industry should play a more active role in communicating about emerging technologies, because they are running ahead, they know more about their technologies, and collaborating with public and authorities, and put a kind of responsibility on the shoulders of the industry with that question. To the next slide. We produced, as a result of that, we actually study an executive report, which is available, and at the end of the slides you will see the link for that. Here I will just provide few examples for you to see what kind of conclusions we have made, and then I will go for each category, one recommendation for each category of the questions. To the next slide. Here you see the EMF regulatory framework and adoption of ICNIRP limits. As we know, in Europe we have the EMF directive as well as 1999 Council recommendation are the basis of EMF regulations in most of the countries in Europe. We see that the question 1 The number of countries that have adopted ECNIP is really minimal. So there are still a lot of countries pending adoption of this these studies, which is a little bit strange looking at when we communicated more detail. Most of the countries are still waiting for the so-called revision of the directive as well as a new council recommendation before they can adopt. So there are just few countries who have adopted the new ECNIP limits. To the next slide. And then we have approval procedure. You see that here the approval procedure is whether multiple authority approval. Almost half of the countries, a little bit less than half of the countries, needs multiple approval. And then approval procedure takes more than 2 months for 20 countries out of 27. They need multiple process for the approval. To the next one. And then we have challenges of availability of compliance assessment standards. So 7 has been telling that there has been the challenges with the availability of the standards, and we noticed that awareness of what is going on in the standards activities, more than half or about half of the countries were not aware of those activities. And the next slide. Here we have protest against 5G. These numbers were actually surprising to me, even though we have heard from the news, but almost 21 countries, there has been the public protest and action against 5G, 21 countries out of 29. And actually, 6 countries, the base stations were physically damaged. So misinformation, 18 countries has informed that they have been dealing and wrestling with the misinformation in the public and in the media. And going to the next. So recommendation 1, EMF regulations, taking into account the fact that ECNIP is revised, it is recommended that European Commission starts to revise their directive as well as the Council recommendation. This is the first recommendation. The second one, recommendation on approval procedure. It is in support for the efficient deployment of 5G, simplified procedures and shorter approval procedures would be beneficial. So since other obstacles for installations seems to be related to the concerns with EMF exposure limits, public acceptability puts a lot of pressure into limiting or decreasing the approval procedure. To the next. Recommendation of compliance assessment. So this is very clear. As a completely science-based assessment would ensure the acceptability. Let's go to the last slide before we can finish. A recommendation on the acceptability by the public. Already commented good comments from the other speakers, but the last one on the risk communication, I would like to tell that before we can. Yeah, and the risk communication for the regulators, it is crucial to establish a dialogue between all the stakeholders concerning the deployment of emerging technologies, in this case 5G. The ingredients for effective dialogue, including consultation with stakeholders, leveraging live or periodic monitoring of EMF levels. Here we have been emphasizing on the base stations, but please, we should also remember the mobile wireless communication devices. The same kind of, actually the same website can also include realistic maximum expected exposure limits for the devices, which could be provided to the public, which would, in sense, people understand that what are the realistic maximum expected power levels for the devices too. So that would give a kind of confidence. So other details are in the slides. If you go to the last slide, I guess this is, concluding remarks are there. And the report, you can have a look at the reports and the details there. So we have emails and contact information there. If any questions, then would be happy to connect with you offline as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jaffa. And I think we'll need to leave it there. We're just about to impinge on the next session. But a big thank you to everyone who's been part of the session and for the comments. And I particularly love the latest chat on what to call the next generation, EcoG or something like that. So it's create a better image. I think that's both fun and an interesting idea. But now time to let the next session move on. So Dan, to hand it back to you at this point.
William, thank you very much, and yeah, really interesting discussion. So yeah, thank you very much for that, and thank you to all of our panelists as well, and of course to Jaffa for that presentation at the end. So yeah, fascinating discussion, and as you said, stimulated quite a bit of chat and comments on the chat bar as well, which is great. So thank you very much. But as William said, we do now need to move on, and we're going to be now starting our second Spectrum short. And we're going to be shifting the topic to look instead of connectivity requirements for drones and unmanned aerial systems. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up our moderator for this second session, who can then explain a bit more detail and obviously introduce our panelists. So I'm going to welcome to the stage Hector Lopez from NERA. Hector, welcome, and great to have you. Hi there.
Thank you so much for the introduction.
No problem. Over to you.
First of all, I'm really delighted to be moderating this panel. I think we have three excellent panelists and experts at the heart of drones and communications. And I am really happy to present our first panelist, Sergio Bovelli. Sergio is the head of Spectrum Aero Connectivity at Airbus, which is currently testing and building drones as we speak. So I'm sure we all want to hear from someone who is making sure that drones have the required connectivity to work well. Sergio, thank you very much for joining us today. Next, let me introduce another expert working at the heart of aviation and Spectrum, John Mitrov. John is the Spectrum policy specialist at the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK and the chairman of the ITU working WP5B. I think we all benefit from your experience working at the heart of rules and regulations, making the distinction between 99.99 reliable and, let me put my life on it, reliable. John, thank you so much for joining us. And our third panelist is Barbara Pareglio. Barbara is the program manager of the Aerial Connectivity Joint Activity, a collaboration between GSMA, which I believe everybody here knows, and the Global Unmanned Traffic Management Association. Barbara, I think, has been working for many years on the technical standards that make global deployment of technologies possible. First in the communications, IoT, and I think now Barbara is working on drones. So Barbara, thank you so much for joining us here today. Well, first of all, I'm really excited about drones. I think every time I think about drones, I think about the future. I think everybody has to watch a movie where the airspace is packed of flying vehicles here and there. And I think that has been a landmark of all the future. So I think the discussion today will help us understand, will help everybody understand how we get from today to that future. And I think connectivity is a big part of it. So with that introduction, and without further ado, let me ask our first panelist, Sergio, a question. So Sergio, in your view, how is connectivity enabling and facilitating the development and deployment of drones and drones applications? And what are the main challenges to be addressed?
Thanks, Hector, and thank you to all who joined this session. I think if we look at most of the current application of drones, of how we call them, unmanned aircraft systems, they are operated in a visual line of sight, and they are based on the usage of smaller UAS with the maximum takeoff weight, which is lower than 25 kilos. So these are used for general public, so as toys or consumer applications, but also for professional applications, quite widely and with a very high increase of user. Currently, regulators and standardization authorities are developing the required frameworks to enable the safe integration of all classes of unmanned aircraft system in all classes of airspace. This includes much bigger unmanned aircraft system carrying even passenger, for example, the aero taxis for urban air mobility, which we are also developing, and other applications such cargo. As you can imagine, connectivity will play a crucial role to enable this application that require going from what is currently based on the usage of unlicensed spectrum and ISM bands to solutions which are using licensed and protected spectrum. And one of the key requirement will be the command and control and of this aircraft and the data link for payload data. For this application, I see the need to enable the usage of existing capacity coming from terrestrial and satellite networks, so such cellular networks, but also fixed satellite services networks. In addition to that, there will be new connectivity link which will be deployed both on terrestrial and satellite connectivity. Actually, this week we are having a meeting of the remote piloted aircraft system panel where we are developing the standard, the recommended practices for C2 links. The goal is to finalize this until October, and this will provide the regulatory base to use several technologies for command and control of remote piloted aircraft and to integrate them in the non-segregated airspace. I see this as one of the biggest challenge for drones. So currently bigger drones are operated in segregated airspace, and the usage of this drone require a very long and complex preparation in order to free airspace and create corridor to make them fly safely. The regulation I just referred to are working to enable the possibility to operate this unmanned aircraft in non-segregated airspace together with other aircraft, with manned aircraft, with general aviation and civil aircraft. And for this, we will need to develop many different regulation, but also regulation for command and control in order to provide the performance that are required for this application and to enable a safe operation of this aircraft. So I think this is a big challenge, but it's also a very interesting activity that I'm very happy to contribute to.
Thank you so much, Sergio. I think one thing that I would like to highlight is the diversity that you mentioned. So many drones, many services, complexity all around, like how do we integrate drones into the airspace and the policies surrounding drones, the rules surrounding drones into other policies and other frameworks. And I think here at the Spectrum Conference, we would like to understand that for Spectrum, what's the difference between the non-safety spectrum and the safety spectrum? And I think with that in mind, I would like to ask our next panelist, John, a question. So as a policy expert, John, working with the UK Civil Aviation Authority, what challenges do you see for what has been traditionally seen as non-safety to now a safety application, and how might that change over time?
Thank you, Hector. I think the first thing I would bring up is actually harmonisation of understanding between the different sectors. Traditionally, aeronautical systems have been provided and designed by aviation. If we're going to move outside of that, then there needs to be a harmonisation in our understandings of terms. If we look at reliability, for instance, as you raised earlier. A comm system may say 99.9% is a good figure to achieve. Yet if you looked, for instance, at Heathrow, that would mean potentially, if you applied it to some of our systems, one accident every other day of an aircraft. So we're looking at maybe 7 nines after the decimal place. And it's how to get those sort of understandings, timeframes, etc., safety cases, to line up. And understand the challenge is also how much spectrum and what type of spectrum. We've talked about C2, but there's also detect and avoid. There's the actual payload data potentially. If you're covering, shall we say, the Tour de France, then you may have quite a good video link that you need to cover, which wouldn't necessarily be classed as safety from an aeronautical perspective. And then there's the coverage. Traditionally, aeronautical systems, we're aiming for 100% coverage over the landmass, certainly, if not over oceans. So then how do you achieve that? And timing, things like latency. Sergio mentioned about going beyond line of sight to actually beyond line of sight, which is all very well. And if you're integrating with manned aircraft, then you need to abide by the sort of timings that they accept. And you're introducing new links that add delay, something that can be got over, but that's something that can affect things. Also, from an aeronautical perspective, they look for global interoperability. So as if you produce a product in one country, as do all other industries, you can buy it in another country as well, or at least ship it across and use it. So you don't necessarily want systems that are regional in their nature of spectrum allocation. And at the moment, it's how do we allow them in? As we move forward, I see it becoming a problem about the integration. And as the airspace gets more utilized, so then we're already talking in ICAO about a situation where air traffic control may not be able to react quickly enough. And therefore, you're going to potentially need these drones to be able to integrate with manned aircraft if they're going to truly be allowed into the airspace and interact in the same way. And that may well include drones, not just the potential, shall we say, cargo fleets that might want to use this sort of technology, but coming down through high altitude platforms that are acting as IMT base stations, through your personal transport systems and delivery drones and things like this. You know, certainly for the UK, a drone with beyond a certain weight is regarded as a safety issue because we've got to protect the public on the ground, not just the flying public. So, yeah, that becomes, I think I'll leave it at that for a minute, Hector, thanks.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks so much, John. I think one key word, or actually two words that you mentioned were harmonization and interoperability. And that has paid off really great in mobile communication. So I can go anywhere in the world and my phone works. And it would be great to have the same for drones. And I think fortunately for us, we have an expert on standards and who is working in a group who is already tackling these issues. So Barbara, could you explain to the audience what's the ACJA doing and what is the scope of the collaboration with Goodman?
Thank you. So yes, ACJA is an area of connectivity joint activity. Is a cooperation, as we mentioned, between the Global UTM Association and GSMA. The Global UTM Association is, as it says, an association of all the participants with the interest in developing the unmanned traffic management of the future. So for the people that maybe are not familiar with the aviation, is at the moment you have the manned aviation, the air traffic controller that are managing all the traffic and is as a human-based type of interface. So all decisions are actually going through the humans. For the unmanned traffic management, obviously, there is no human in the loop anymore. So the system has to change. So we need innovation there. And connectivity is basically a foundation that is needed. Any type of connectivity is the foundation needed there for supports BVLOS, as we mentioned, so beyond visual line of sight. So where the pilot is not anymore in the sight of the drones. So what we did is we created these cooperations because we need to work together indeed from the telco, but also from the aviations, to understand each other, first of all, to understand what are the requirements of the aviation and the UTM, and see what we have from the connectivity aspect, and then find where we can cooperate. And this cooperation, as the name says, is based on the connectivity aspect. So we worked, John mentioned there are different services in the aviation. So you have the payload is possibly the most traditional where we normally work, because what you do in the phone, you know, to send a video or something. So the payload is the easiest to imagine. We can use the cellular network. But we also look at how to use the cellular network in other areas where there are pre-flight and in-flight operation. If we look at the pre-flight, is understanding the connectivity, that's one. As you mentioned, connectivity and having the coverage is very important. So we worked with the community to find the appropriate way to provide information of the right level of quality of services that is needed throughout the flight for supporting the operation. And this varies from flight to flight because the operations are very different for the drones. And at the moment, just to point, we're looking at drones that they're flying at low altitude, let's say below 400, 500 feet, because this is the unregulated space, is where we see the best benefit that the mobile networks will bring for this type of operation. The other parts that we're looking is how to support the new regulation that came out for the remote identification, particularly in collaboration in Europe, is called USpace, which is the UTM. And we also work on how to understand the performances-based approach that the aviation has for the connectivity, for the C2 link, as they call it, command and control link, and to specify what we need to do and what are the parameters and the performances that the mobile operator can offer. So there's a lot of work that it's ongoing in the community. SCGA is actually, at the moment, we have 4 different groups where they're working on different tasks. And we also try to push where it's possible to the standardization in 3GPP. So we do it 2 sides. We worked with the standardization in 3GPP for the mobile networks, but we also work with other standards like EuroCAI and the joint activity with DART-TCA in order to make sure that there is an alignment and we are supporting the industry as much as possible. So that is our vision as ACJA, and is a really mix between members that are from the aviations and from the telco. And I'll stop right there for the moment.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I think I would like to, before we continue, I would like to remind the audience to send their questions. If you want to ask a question for a specific speaker, just mention that in the chat, and we would be very happy to read it. And I think we already have some questions, so let me go here. I think this is for John. What problems do you see in the actual regulations for a realistic implementation of BS mounted on drones? I'm not sure what BS means. To serve disaster and crowd, of course, to serve disaster or crowd scenarios. And this question comes from Germán Castellanos.
Thanks, Hector. At the moment, I don't actually see a large number of practical problems with it. There are some institutional problems. For instance, a lot of the mobile spectrum used by mobile phones actually excludes use for aeronautical use, which communicating with a drone counts as. But I see that as an institutional problem rather than necessarily a practical problem. If you're talking about disasters, I think we would all rather take the pragmatic solution and actually get on and use it, rather than actually stand on our regulatory horses and say, no, you can't. Crowded scenarios may be a slightly different issue, because then you may be talking about areas where those frequencies are already used for certain purposes, and you would need to probably actually deconflict. But I know, certainly in the UK, we've already been doing some trials that if you've got flooding, can you actually get base stations in using drones to, or high altitude platforms, to actually serve that community and get aid there quicker than otherwise possible. I hope that answers the question.
Perfect. Well, thank you. I think you mentioned something interesting, which is a particular challenge of the integration of existing networks and drones. And I would like to understand, all of you three, your view about the interactions between existing networks and the future drones. So I see on the one hand, drones may provide solutions for existing networks. So the base station on a drone, or we are talking about hubs reaching and providing transport for remote areas. On the other hand, you want the smaller drones to be always connected. So how do you see the role of the existing networks and the existing MNOs, and how do they supplement or compete with for different things with drones? I'm not sure if someone wants to take it first.
I can take it. I mean, I do work also in other areas which would look in indeed apps or how all this different technology that can be utilized. There is obviously different way that you can see how this is going to be integrated. One is mentioned by John is we need to look at obviously the spectrum, and we need to understand what are the interferences that we have in the different cases. But then there is also different type of things that you can do. For example, low altitude drones that are acting as a base station. And in that case, I also say there are different regulations from the aviation perspective, but they are different if you have a drone which is actually flying or is tethered, so it's basically anchored. And there's a lot of these different solutions that are already in place for disaster response. And also the utilization, as you mentioned, is more historical traditions, that is terrestrial use of the spectrum, is pretty much more prominent in Europe. In other parts of the world, this is not seen as an issue. So it's not everywhere treated in the same way. From the hubs perspective, I would say, then you're looking at different type of coverage. So the apps, or if you go higher in altitude, then obviously you have a much broader coverage. And you need to think about the capacity, the number of users that you need to have, what you provide, what type of services you're providing. So if you are obviously like closer, then you have, like you would be using even millimeter wave or something else, then you have, better latency, more capacities. You can have more of that. The higher up you go, then you do it more for a broader coverage, for providing basic services, but maybe you don't have such a high capacity. So you need to, they all will be integrated. And obviously, we see 5G is playing a good role, because 5G will be able to manage all of this, and then you can also manage much better the spectrum. But we don't have, I would say, a solution that fits all at the moment. It's still work in progress in finding out all these integration points on all the different solutions that we have. And maybe Airbus has more, because I know you guys do also a lot of work.
So, anyone else? Okay. So, John?
Just a quick point. I think in a way, sort of the low-level drones that Barbara was talking about and the use space, they've got a good opportunity. If you can get it right, that whole design, then that could be actually migrated into manned aircraft as well and the manned world. So we've got a chance to design something that works. And of course, for aircraft, weight costs money because you're having to support that in the air, which comes back to the sort of eco type of systems. So I think, the more we can integrate, but still meet those safety targets, the better. How we achieve it is the interesting debate. Thanks.
Yes. Maybe just an additional aspect that is worth to mention. I think that the possibility to use spectrum or to extend the usage of spectrum to additional applications, for example, the spectrum which is used on terrestrial network, enabling the possibility to use this spectrum also for additional application in flying objects. I think this would enable the possibility to have more optimal usage of the spectrum, increasing the and achieving less expensive service, because then we could have the deployment of networks also in places where at the moment it's not worth to be deployed. And I think this would also enable additional applications, both for the aeronautical community, for the aeronautical industry, but also for the terrestrial industry.
Sergio, maybe a follow-up question. Do you think we need drones spectrum, or should we better use aviation spectrum, or should we integrate terrestrial spectrum to aviation and make associate of that drones? How do you see the integration of all these parts that we right now use as labels, but I mean, physics, the spectrum is a spectrum. Where do drones fit?
Yes, as I said before, we are investigating different options. Of course, the ITU define aeronautical spectrum, and for this we are considering the usage of aeronautical spectrum also for application to remote piloted aircraft or drones. But we are also investigating the possibility to use spectrum, which is currently used for other application, also for application to drones. I think that the way we are looking at the moment, it's really to look at the performance that a link is able to provide, and measure the possibility to use a certain technology, a certain spectrum for an application to drones based on the performance that this link can provide and not on the type of spectrum.
So I think John had an opinion. So what do you think? Is spectrum from drones or no?
I think in the short term, we're going to have to find something to fill in as it stands. But in doing that, we can always, as I say, start the whole idea of where you're moving forward to. So in a way, it gives us a blank sheet to start working a new, what I would call airspace management system. Not air traffic, but airspace management, because I think we're going to have to allow for a lot of other things. I agree with Sergio. We need to be performance-based. And what needs to be done is demonstrate that what we are using and how we are using meets the safety targets. Now, that may well, safety cases that we are used to in aviation that demonstrate the fact that you meet your requirement, validation of software to make sure it can't do stuff that it shouldn't do. Various things like this are the sort of ways forward there. So I think as long as we've got performance-based, then, and we can demonstrate that, then it doesn't necessarily matter so much about what the spectrum is labelled. And it comes down to the technology. It may be that the best solution ends up, you take technology and you put it in bands nominally designated for aeronautical, but it's an integration of both types. It may be that we just leave it as it stands and remove some of the regulatory barriers, such as just, go through some WRCs and formally remove the restriction against aeronautical use. We have to wait and see, I think, but the main thing is to meet the performance base, and that performance base may be getting actually tighter because of your proximity to the ground, if you're talking about low-level drones, or to other aircraft as we put more into the airspace. So, I always wonder with aviation, do we worry about how many instances we have per flight hour, or do we worry about how many instances we have per year? What's the perception for the public? If it's per year, then actually that's an ever-changing number because the number of flights is going up. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. I think both you and Sergio mentioned one word, I think more than a couple of times, performance. So on the technical side, how should we think about performance for services and for communications links in drones? Do we have already a neat categorization of these are my services and this is my required performance and this is the priority? And how do we get from wherever we are to having that table that anyone working at implementation would need to know where should the spectrum go? So who's better to talk about that? I think maybe Barbara wants to say something.
Maybe I can start, but then definitely John would be able and Sergio would be able to say more. As far as I know, there is no categorization as you mentioned in that way. So there is a categorization more related to the safety category. So there have been some work done, for example, by JARUS, which is a joint authority on rulemaking for the aviations, where they defined SORA, which is looking at the drones in Europe. They're called specific. So there are three categories in Europe. The open category that you can see in the open category is more like the consumer type of drones, the smaller drones, or the one that flies in the visual line of sight. Then you have the specific, which is, I would say, more commercial type of operation that you do there, but you also do BV loss. And then you have the certified. The certified are basically like the normal planes manned aircraft. They go to the same level. In a specific, particularly because that's where we look at where you have BV loss and you still do operation to different altitude, but at least the majority would be still to an uncontrolled airspace. In that area, you have different safety category, but they don't tell you per se what the operation is. So it's up to the drone operator, the one that actually manages the service, to identify what is the safety category. And then depending on that, you will have performances requirement based on the safety that you need to maintain. And then there is work ongoing in further identify more aspects so that you have better information to make the decision and simplify the process of the drone operator, because it's a lot of work for the individual company to to do all this work and assess the safety and how you prove it, and it takes quite some time. The intention also from the regulation point of view is try to create template which simplifies. So if you have done it for one case and you keep doing the same type of operation, then it's much easier and the process speeds up, because it's also how we speed up the process for having a more economic, sustainable solution. So that, as far as I know, these are the categories we talk about. But from our side, for example, for the telco, we also need to understand, because performances are based on what you ask for. So in quality, in latency, so we need somehow to identify this high-level category so that we give you the performances. And the work, I think, is started in discussion in the aviation industry, how they do that. But I don't think there is a clear table, as you mentioned, to classify everything. At least that's from what I know. But I'm sure that you, John, and Sergio knows more.
Yes,
Yeah.
maybe I can add a little bit on that. As Barbara said, the assessment of the safety of an operation it's normally risk-based, and of course there are many different aspects that contribute to the definition of how risky is a certain operation. And of course, if you are considering a very light drone, which is less than 250 grams, for example, in the current regulation almost worldwide, then the possibility to use this even close to people, to crowd, it's given, and then you are operating in an open class. Of course, if you consider a very large aircraft, which is operating in completely different situation, which is very fast and so on, then in this case the level of risk is increasing. What we are doing for the communication side, as I mentioned before, we are developing in the ICAO, in a remote piloted aircraft system panel, a document which is describing the link performance that is required for command and control, which is the most crucial link that is required to operate a drone. And you will see, if you look at what we are developing, that also the description of this link requirement is quite generic, because of course also the capability of a drone is different, and depending of the capability of a drone, for example, the possibility to operate when the link is not available could be different depending on the implementation of the drone. So the level of autonomy, of the possibility, for example, if you are able to fly very slow, or if you are not able to fly very slow, it could make a big difference. And then therefore, we are defining a methodology to develop to characterize the link performance for a drone, the required link performance, but you will not have a table which is providing characteristic for all drones. This is something which will not be given, because you are at the end, in particular for the certified drones, certifying the aircraft, including the link, and the link will be one part of the system, and what you are certifying is in principle the whole system.
Right, John, any final comment? I think we are reaching the end of our discussion here.
Just a quick couple of points. I think I agree with both panelists. I think the issue comes down to very much a case of how quickly could a incident occur, so separation distance, speed of closure, against what actually is the impact. So if you're talking about a light drone flying over some hillsides where all you're going to do is lose the drone, probably not too much of a worry. If you're talking about something that's flying close to people or other aircraft, and the potential is that you are going to endanger life, then there's going to be a lot different level of requirement on it. And I think, as Sergio says, this is something that's being discussed. The other part is the autonomy. You know, if aviation with its air traffic control moves to more digital commands, then the aircraft itself, the autonomous aircraft, can respond whilst informing the pilot what it's doing. If you've still got to wait, like with voice, for that to be relayed to the pilot to then respond back to the aircraft, and the aircraft to then pass that message back, there's a whole different delay process that's got to be considered. So I think I'll cover it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So I'm not sure. I think we are, if not done, very much to close on. So thank you so much. Do you have any closing remarks or last message that you would like to give to our audience? Nothing? Well,
No.
okay. Thank you. I think Dan is here. Dan, thank you so much for putting this panel together. I think we all learned a lot about the requirements of drones and how we, from the communication side and on the aviation side, can integrate systems and make sure that we have a good way to make the future a reality. I actually want to see flying vehicles everywhere, and I'm excited to take a drone taxi, a flying taxi, to the airport next time I fly somewhere for a conference, talking about spectrum and the future. Well, thank you so much, Dan.
Hector, thank you very much. And yeah, thank you also to Sergio, to John, and to Barbara as well. And yeah, and a really interesting discussion. I think it's the first time we've ever covered the issue of connectivity for drones at a Spectrum event, but I'm sure it's not going to be the last, because it's definitely something that, yeah, I'm sure there's going to be lots of discussion in the coming years on. So thank you all very much. A really, really interesting session. Thank you. So we now have a short break. So we have around about 20 minutes or so as a break. And then we're back here for the final of our 3 Spectrum shorts, which is going to be focusing on fixed wireless access. We're back here at 3 o'clock for that. And don't forget, that's then going to be followed straight away by It's a Wrap, which is our closing ceremony, where we're going to be having final conclusions, final event takeaways from some of our speakers. And it's also a chance to crack open a drink, and we're going to be having some live music to close the event. Thank you again to all of our speakers in both that last session on drones and also the previous one on EMF. 2 fascinating discussions. Have a quick break, time to stretch your legs, and we'll see you back here in now around about 17 minutes for the start of our final session. Thank you, everyone.